In past episodes of Exploring North Carolina, we've told you about North Carolina's 17 river basins, each with more than 40 inches of rain per year. We've taken you to mountaintops and ridges, where drips become trickles, trickles become creeks, creeks become streams, and streams become rivers. We've watched those rivers spread out in the Piedmont and in the coastal plain before arriving at their destination, sea level. We've stressed the importance of buffers, robust, woody buffers that allow runoff from land to enter streams clear and pure. And we've celebrated clean water as it dances over waterfalls and provides habitat for fish, birds, and countless other creatures. We've also shown you a very special kind of water, black water. It is the color of iced tea or weak coffee as it flows slowly across the coastal plain. We've seen this mysterious golden liquid in the Black River, where it flows into the Cape Fear, at Fort Bragg, and as it flows into the Albemarle Sound from coastal creeks. But what we have not told you is that some rivers in North Carolina begin and end in the coastal plain as blackwater rivers. Unlike mountain and Piedmont rivers that often plunge several hundred or several thousand feet during their journey to the ocean, some rivers of the coastal plain may fall less than 10 feet over many miles. Blackwater rivers invariably formed in pocosins, deep deposits of peat and other rich organic matter which holds water like a sponge. And it allows water to move slowly by gravity over many miles before forming some of our most beautiful creeks and coastal rivers. Today, Exploring North Carolina takes you to the pocosin, where rivers are born. Exploring North Carolina is privileged to interview some of the preeminent foresters and hydrologists in North Carolina today. We talked with Dr. Joe Royce, Professor of Forestry and Director of Graduate Programs at the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at North Carolina State University. We visited with Dr. Fred Cubbage, Professor of Forest Economics and Natural Resource Policy, also at North Carolina State. We enlisted a water expert at NCSU, Assistant Professor of Hydrology in the College of Natural Resources, Dr. Ryan Emanuel. I asked them to define the word pocosin as it is understood in eastern North Carolina.
Well, pocosin is a Native American term for swamp on a hill, and that's what it is. It's a raised bog, so it sits between drainages and a high place on the landscape.
Pocosins, they are a perched watershed, which is basically a watershed that actually is up above the normal elevation at that point on the landscape, and it actually is a wet area elevated above the rest of the landscape. Even though it's higher, it's still wet.
So the topography in the outer coastal plain is very subtle. When we look at it, we say this is just flat, but it's not perfectly flat. Even a little bit, a few feet of rise over several miles is enough to cause water to drain and to flow and to create river basins. So we really do have river basins in this region, even though it's hard to see and hard to tell.
I wanted to know how lands, once considered wastelands and swamps, our remaining pocosins, provide services and benefit our lives in a variety of ways. Fred Cubbage, the economist, and Ryan Emanuel, the hydrologist, had answers.
They provide a host of what we call ecosystem services or ecosystem functions, and those are going to be clean water, clean air, carbon dioxide, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and other activities like that. And really, maybe one of the advantages of the pocosins is that because they have been wetter and because they've been less easily cleared and converted to more developed agricultural or urban uses, they do remain and provide those ecological services and functions, buffering water quality, probably providing recharge to groundwater. So they provide a host of services that really provide the environmental green infrastructure that really makes our lives livable.
These ecosystems provide a lot of benefits to the estuaries. They provide fresh water, they provide regulated water quality, they provide animal habitat, and they also have this ability to sequester carbon from the atmosphere.
For many North Carolinians, it is difficult to imagine how dense pocosins can be for man and beast.
Even though the pocosin grows slowly, it does grow extremely dense. And when you first come across the pocosin, you look into it and all you see is green. And trying to move through it is almost impossible. You can get down on your hands and knees and follow old bear trails, but to actually move through the pocosin, you need some tools to either hack the stuff out of the way or something to lay on top of it and you can walk over top of it. But the vegetation is extremely thick.
Well, many people have talked about the forest on the Hoffman as being a planted forest and inferred that it's really just a modest planted forest. Well, I have actually worked in many planted forests, and the Hoffman is the densest, thickest, brushiest area that one could imagine. And really, it's not just any planted forest. It is a deep, thick, really swamp. So it is a very distinct ecosystem that has planted trees and a huge amount of natural vegetation and brush that makes it one of the densest, thickest forests in the coastal plain.
I cannot explain the vastness of our remaining pocosins at Holly Shelter, Croatan Forest, Hoffman Forest, and the Great Dismal Swamp without showing you. Here you will see roads extending in every direction as far as the eye can see before coming to a point on the horizon. Hoffman Forest alone is approximately 125 square miles of contiguous land comprising almost 80,000 acres. It is 25 miles north to south at its longest point and up to 20 miles wide. Across the landscape, you will find many plant communities and planted plots of loblolly pine, longleaf pine, and the magnificent Atlantic white cedar. In the Hoffman, you better have a full tank of gas because you will find 400 miles of unpaved road and may never see a single car, and certainly not a filling station. Like Montana, North Carolina has its own big sky country, where forest and roads extend from horizon to horizon. To see wild places like this, go to Holly Shelter Game Lands, Croatan National Forest, or the Great Dismal Swamp. It is difficult to imagine how tea-colored water can be pure, and that here in the flat coastal plain, distinct river basins exist.
So even though pocosins produce water that's the color of iced tea, it's actually clean water. This water has its color because it comes in contact with organic material in the soils, and it spends so much time in contact with that organic material, it basically steeps in that soil and in those environments, and it produces this rich tea color. So pocosins receive most of their water from rain. They're rain-fed systems. Once that rain reaches the ground, it tends to move very slowly because, again, there's no gradient. There's no big drop over the land surface. So that water moves through the soils very slowly, in some cases years, before it emerges in the streams as stream flow.
A pocosin is a collection of organic soils that's formed over thousands of years, and it acts as a sponge. So when it rains on it, the organic material soaks up that water and releases it very slowly into the surrounding streams.
This is the tea-colored water found across the coastal plain. Without the giant organic sponges in which it is stored, it would cease to exist. You may have wondered how our great remaining pocosins were set aside, and when. Fred Cubbage had the answer.
These three properties in particular have evolved differently in their management and their ownership, right? So I know less about Holly Shelter, but really it's a game reserve and provides basically biodiversity and wildlife habitat. The National Forest, the Croatan, all the national forests in the coastal plain were authorized for purchase under the Weeks Law initially, but that was amended by the Clark-McNary Act in 1924, which allowed purchase of these national forests in the east. Those were private lands that were purchased back, were abandoned and then purchased back. As the name implies, really the forest was acquired by Julius Hoffman, who was the first dean of the School of Forestry at that time. He was a professor who came to North Carolina State University from Penn State University and started the first forestry program at North Carolina State University. And really, when he came in the early 30s, I think, he said, really, we need to have a place to practice and demonstrate and show what the profession of forestry is all about. This particular tract was, of course, not of such high value, nor did it have a very good title. So Hoffman was able to put it together, assemble it, to actually purchase it for $300,000 at the time, which even at that time was quite a good price.
Perhaps the most famous pocosin and one of the most famous forests in America is Hoffman Forest. I asked one of North Carolina's most distinguished foresters, K.O. Kenneth Somerville, to tell us about his association with this unique resource. In his career, K.O. Somerville has worked with Duke Power, the U.S. Forest Service, North Carolina State University, and for many years was with the North Carolina State Forest Service as tree improvement forester for the entire state.
I became a student of forestry in 1954. And I think it was our junior year, which would have been summer of '56, we got to spend a little bit of time on the Hoffman and become familiar with the heat and humidity and the mosquitoes and everything else that's down there. Learning about what forest practices are like for the eastern North Carolina. The exact, for me to be able to put a figure on a dollar figure, say, on it exactly, I'm not good at that. But in terms of knowing that it has value from the standpoint of perpetuating specific plant communities, it's unequal. It's my understanding that the Hoffman Forest was acquired in 1934 as the white oak pocosin by Dr. Hoffman, who was at that time the head of the Department of Forestry at NC State University. He and others saw a need to have a tract of land to teach students on about forest practices. The pocosin, white oak pocosin, became available, and they were able to arrange financing and acquired it for the college.
As a forester with vast experience across the entire state, I asked Somerville about the importance of all of our remaining pocosins.
The Holly Shelter, the Hoffman Forest, Croatan National Forest, areas around Lake Waccamaw, up some of the Dismal Swamp areas are of benefit as a water resource reservoir, but also for the preservation of some of the niche plant communities that are there, as well as some of your other animals, that birds, in particular migratory birds.
I wanted Ryan Emanuel to tell me more about the niche plants found in pocosins. One would think that because pocosin soils are acidic, and lack phosphorus and nitrogen, plants would have a hard time. On the contrary, nature has filled these high sponges with some of the most unique plants on Earth.
In many cases, pocosins are relatively acidic and nutrient-poor environments. And that's a great place for things to grow, like the Venus flytrap, which gets a lot of its nutrients from the insects that it captures.
In my conversation with our experts from North Carolina State University, 2 more issues regarding pocosins were raised, which may be critically important to generations to come: the quality of our estuaries and the storage of carbon dioxide. Ryan Emanuel and Fred Cubbage explain.
So brownwater river is a term that we sometimes use to describe rivers and streams that start in the Piedmont or in the mountains. And we call them that because they're carrying a relatively high load of sediment. That sediment is what gives the water its brownish, or in some cases its reddish color. On the other hand, in the coastal plain, because we don't have the gradient, we don't have that steep rise, the streams are not carrying a lot of sediment. On the contrary, they're carrying organic matter. And so that's the main difference between brown water and black water. Yeah, so blackwater rivers are bringing water, fresh water, to the estuaries and sounds. So in a sense, it's keeping the salt water at bay. These estuaries are not as salty as the ocean, they're brackish. And so that brackishness comes from a mixture of ocean water and the fresh water that comes in many cases from blackwater rivers.
You know, we're very aware about how important it is to keep and store carbon and really to ameliorate the carbon emissions that we're making. And really, forests provide one of the largest and better ways to do this. It may be that they provide up to probably about 12 to 15% of total global carbon emissions can be sequestered if we keep the forest we have in forest. So they provide, basically it's just the chemistry, right? You're taking carbon out of the air and creating wood, right? So we're creating carbon in that. And furthermore, they actually, especially the pocosins, are creating much more carbon in the soil. The soil captures vast amounts of carbon. It's like peat, which is almost congealed carbon essentially. And so it has very deep carbon, and the pocosins have the deepest amount of total carbon in the soils of probably anywhere in North Carolina.
Because of the many services performed by North Carolina's remaining pocosins, I ask our experts what happens when forests are removed and the pocosin lands are farmed or developed for urban purposes.
If you were to convert the pocosin into some other use other than being a forest, say agriculture. So for agriculture, you would have to drain the land. Actually, for development, you'd have to drain the land. And so as soon as you start to drain the land using ditches, you're going to have the organic soils are going to start to decay like a regular organic material, and you'll have a tremendous loss of carbon storage from the just from the soil conversion. The sponge eventually will be decayed down into a mineral soil. It might take decades to do, but as that happens, you'd have a tremendous input of on a per unit area basis of carbon into the atmosphere.
If you remove the plant cover from a pocosin and expose those soils to the atmosphere or convert them to agriculture, and at the same time if you lower the water table, you will cause not only the carbon that was stored in the trees and vegetation to be lost, but you also cause loss of carbon in the soils as that soil literally decomposes.
Because of the vast size of our remaining pocosins, there is another function often forgotten in North Carolina, one of the most militarily friendly states in the nation.
So the open lands anywhere benefit the military at a minimum, in that the military is running flight paths all over the state of North Carolina, in fact the country, but of course in North Carolina we have the 2 big bases, maybe another couple air bases as well. So there's always running flight paths. So open lands provide an area where they can have maneuvers at low altitude and at night.
Because all of our guests are associated with forestry at North Carolina State University, I asked them how pocosins in general and how Hoffman Forest in particular have benefited North Carolina State University and the state of North Carolina.
So it's just a fount of information and reference to start with, and it really is the crown jewel of the forestry program, and it has been ever since its acquisition. As we said, it's the largest single educational forest that we know of in the world, and I've been to some that are very close in China, but ours is still larger. And it really is the largest state land, and it provides a source of pride that really has pervaded, everybody knows North Carolina State because we have the Hoffman Forest.
NC State has been famous worldwide for as long as I've been around because of it has control and management of a large land area. Forest management is not something you do on an acre or a hectare. Forest management is something you do on hundreds of thousands of acres or millions of acres. So it requires a large land area that you are protecting and conserving for the future.
We lose the opportunity to get out and see what a wonderful creation we live in. We have the opportunity in large tracts of land to get completely insulated from other interests, other aspects of life, to just relax, kick back, and enjoy being out of doors. Again, it's difficult to put a dollar figure on something like that. Fortunately, we have in North Carolina some large tracts in the coastal plain, through the Piedmont, and in the mountains. And to think of losing large acreages to other interests just sort of runs against my nature.
Pocosin ecosystems used to occupy a much larger fraction of the coastal plain than they do today. And so one of the valuable things about these large tracts of land, like Croatan, like Holly Shelter, like the Hoffman, is the ability to see the full spectrum of these environments at very large scales.
As with salt marsh, pocosins, the high swamps of the coastal plain, have long been misunderstood and even reviled by some people, including the father of our country, George Washington, who wanted to drain the entire Great Dismal Swamp. Today, a substantial percentage of southeastern pocosins have been cut over, ditched, and drained to make way for towns and for large agricultural holdings. We now understand that pocosins, giant living sponges, not only benefit wildlife, carnivorous plants, and coastal communities, but growing populations of North Carolinians who are just beginning to appreciate their value. Take a walk on the wild side at one of North Carolina's remaining pocosins, where rivers are born, and discover their value and magic. And I learned this while exploring North Carolina.